Hello guys. Question. Do video games even need the internet? Back in the 90s, before the web took over, video games went from arcade machines to home consoles and they slowly worked their way up to home computers. And I bring this up because video games back in the beginning didn't have internet. They used to be designed and conceptualized as game first, meaning that the game was built from the ground up as a self-contained fun experience without the internet. The internet slowly removed the self-contained aspects that video games were conceptualized from the ground level as, to the extent that games now are designed with completely different values from the single-player driven experiences that created them before the internet was even a thing. Even though gaming and the internet were two separate things, around the 2000s they started to merge with each other, and the internet nowadays is so rooted in the DNA of modern games that most games are built from the ground level up with its implementation in mind. In my opinion, this harms the overall experience, and not only in a game perspective, but also an art's perspective. Back when the technology was still new, developers created hardware with the sole intent of playing software. Games didn't have any sort of cultural push or intellectual importance, so they had to survive on merit alone. Arcade machines stretched from the 1970s to the 1990s before they were replaced by consoles around the 2000s. And as they started to change and improve, they slowly started to look more and more like computers. Consider this: am I using the internet when I use the Xbox, or am I playing a game? While the internet had its advantages, its ability to fix games bugs and give updates and sell DLC, along with multiplayer, apparently they still decided to strip the core experience, almost making it feel like you have to buy the DLC and wait till the updates to fix a game. Increased use of internet features in video games slowly changed the market as internet implementation became easier and easier. By taking advantage of that, they guaranteed they would get more and more return on their investments. By watering down the experience and slowly drip feeding you updates over time, they created situations where games didn't feel finished when they came out, all thanks to the internet's ability to add more and more to a game after its release. Video games went from a disc you give to your console to play the game, to a software your console will download off the disc and then allow you to play. In order to play a video game, you either need a console or a device that enables your ability to play the game. Once the disc went from housing the game to simply housing the download code, the distance between you and the game effectively increased. It's important to mention that as the industry grew, we the audience and supporters of said industry also grew alongside it. When we were kids, we didn't even know what a 100 gigabyte update was. Hell, we didn't even know what a gigabyte was. We just knew that we buy game, we play game. But now that equation had changed. Now we buy game, wait for game to download, then we play game. Little did we know that wait it took for us to get from having the game to playing the game would snowball into a complete different landscape for the gaming industry. As the initial reason to justify this change was a direct result of the internet getting more and more implementation to the point that developers were no longer limited by the physical space in a disc because they could always add more content later. A game no longer needed to be a certain amount of space. The only limitations now were your own hardware's limited memory. I personally think this was a bad thing, as to put space limitations on the consumer when before the developer needed to have a clear vision and optimize it so it fit into the limited memory on disc, would create a more lean gaming experience. But we didn't need to care about space because the game was housed on the disc like a movie. But now we did. Now without the restrictions, it's too common seeing games release, not finished, and getting more and more game size updates to fix whatever is wrong with it, disregarding the consumer's limitations. Games need to be finished, and if we allow it to not be so, developers will treat their game's optimization as an afterthought and put the burden on us, the consumer. To try and explain how the transition affected games design itself, I want to talk about multiplayer. You see, as games began to develop from a purely single player driven offline experience into a more multiplayer online player driven one, so did the ways that we not only develop games but also conceptualize them. So how did multiplayer overall change over time along with the way that we make games? Before, developers would spend time creating assets and worlds tying in fun game loops that increase in difficulty into a narrative that reinforce the game's themes, optimized and polished to ship on a disc. I would argue that games now are developed as multiplayer first. as it was cheaper for developers to create the framework of a game so that multiple people could play together, and then maybe they would create a single player campaign with the extra assets. The single player experience became an afterthought to the always online multiplayer, taking more and more resources from the main experience, the single player. 99% went into making the graphics and game mechanics shiny in order to host big groups of parties, turning games into virtual spaces. Creating the skeleton and making the online gameplay the main focus was easier and cheaper than taking the time to make a complete game experience. In the beginning, most games that included multiplayer only did so as a bonus, an added extra experience that fit into the core focus, the single player content. This started to shift as game companies discovered profitability was more possible in online environments, as social environments would make it possible to make more sales in-game after the initial sale, turning the game into a vendor for an additional profit, as opposed to just a good self-contained game experience. Keyword self-contained, as the internet holds the door open for additional content sneaking in microtransactions into the equation. Sure, they're adding more content, but at what cost? Multiplayer design converted games into hamster wheels that are never completed because self-contained experiences allow for a sense of ending, while multiplayer games are designed to be played for as long as possible, never stopping. In single-player games, loops are laid down by developers, allowing them to increase the difficulty and connecting it to a story with a clear ending, always leading you somewhere with some sense of themes that reinforce the gameplay. Online games to me don't have a really good sense of story, so they don't really have a meaningful endpoint. Important for games to have endpoints, as art works best as a self-contained experience. A self-contained aspect of a game can be attributed to kind of being the soul, a one-time single-player experience. But the mechanics that enable gameplay so that multiplayer can happen is kind of seen as the body. Online game loops never really end, and this is why I see new games as soulless hamster wheels. To create a body that houses no soul so that it can enable the gameplay that multiplayer takes place on. Online service games make more money the longer you're there, so it's designed to keep you engaged with it as long as possible, as opposed to a single player experience that only is really there to facilitate the game experience, or the soul. Older gaming experiences felt so timeless because games were used to be allowed to age, as pieces of art as well as reflections of their times, and now they're more like soulless junk. When you make a single player driven experience, one can be hyper specific about the things they want the players to feel at any given moment. To get a little philosophical, many people consider games a modern form of art, a new medium to tell stories and show experiences. I would argue that started to change as gaming got bigger. With the continued use of the internet and feature games, gaming began to lose its self-contained nature. Marked by the move from single-player experiences to multiplayer-focused modes, multiplayer was no longer a secondary dish to the main course. It became the main course. Regular co-op didn't allow developers to insert themselves as middlemen. That meant that all the attention started to shift to the idea of online multiplayer, because it made more money than having a ready-to-play full single-player campaign. A campaign handcrafted to teach you the game, increase the challenge over time, possibly tie in a story with themes that reinforce the gameplay, and then end. The old way. Before a game felt complete, you would jump in and escape into another world and have fun, changing your reality into something new via puzzles and tests that simulate a creative experience, like reading a book. Now it's like you're stepping into a racing track looped together by the developers that have invaded the game through the online connection so that they can continue to sell you things that are actually useless outside the game space itself. Games lost their escape factor because online multiplayer became more important than whatever core the game was supposed to have. That core is literally the experience the game is supposed to give, the art, or the gaming escape. The factor that makes a good game feel like a painting or a book. Sadly, the intent isn't the story or even the experience anymore. It became about the online multiplayer, or the endless grind. The body that used to house the experience began to be seen as more important than the experience. Companies knew empty games like those could be more heavily monetized with the increased control it gave them to continually add more content. This kind of meant games were no longer a medium for art as they used to be.
Games are now soulless products, virtual hamster wheels that sell you stuff while you take up space in their servers. The ones who are hosting the games are using psychology in order to turn gamers into money batteries. This is why games feel like services nowadays. Game companies used to offer us goods, works of arts that they would spend years crafting. The medium that once enabled new forms of art was becoming a medium for profit and commercial interest. All this has come ahead in the modern day, where most of the major releases are practically designed for this type of environment. Sure, games can now be fixed after release, which is better than before, but before games didn't ship broken. Making a whole game without the internet requires more testing and more polish, because after the game leaves the office, you can no longer change it, you can no longer open it back up, and you can no longer profit from it. An always online game is never completed, never optimized, and never tested. Games are art because they are close and finished experiences. How can one admire a painting that's not allowed to dry? Since the vision for the game cannot be achieved without including games as a service in the age of the internet, then they can't be art because that art doesn't come first. The difference between an art gallery and a painting is that you buy tickets to see the art in a gallery. You pay for the access to the art. Games are now closer to content, not art. Online games are built on empty, soulless foundations, psychologically made to keep you in a loose state of engagement for as long as possible, so that they can monetize every second you're there. In my opinion, if the game is not conceptualized from the ground up as a multiplayer experience, it's gonna try to fill that void with lesser content. The higher quality of lesser content is enabled by the increased control the developers get over your experience, practically taking away your ownership. But yeah, those are my thoughts, and leave a like if you like, and yeah, just gonna try to improve. New year, new me.